Hi, friends. Maggie Creech here, host of Revolution Revisited. If you've been tuning in, you know we're diving deep into the people and stories that made the American Revolution what it really was. Messy, bold, and full of rebellion right here in Virginia. And if you've learned something new or found yourself saying, wait, I never knew that, I'd love your help spreading the word. Wherever you listen, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, leave us a rating or a quick review. It only takes a few seconds, but it helps more listeners discover Revolution Revisited and supports the work of the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, the team behind this show. Every review keeps history alive and keeps Virginia's stories in the spotlight as we commemorate America's 250th anniversary. So go ahead, hit those stars, drop a line, and keep spreading the word. Thanks for listening and for making history with us.
Welcome to Revolution Revisited, your crash course in the American Revolution. As the 250th anniversary of America's independence approaches, dive into the stories of Virginia's rebels, rule breakers, and rabble-rousers who shaped a nation. This podcast is brought to you by the Virginia Museum of History and Culture and made possible by William and Karen Fralin.
Welcome back to Revolution Revisited. I'm your host, Maggie Creech. Quick. When you hear someone talking about the document in the mid-1770s that pushed freedom forward and ignited military action in the Revolutionary War, what document do you think about? Most of our minds might go to the Declaration of Independence. But today, we're talking about another document, one that was just as foundational to freedom for scores of enslaved people in Virginia and propelled the conflict between the Patriots and the British even further. Words on a page can change the course of lives and ignite panic. In the late autumn of 1775, Lord Dunmore, the last royal governor of Virginia, reached for a desperate weapon, other people's bondage. His proclamation promised freedom, but only for those who would fight for the crown. For some, it was viewed as a cynical ploy to bring rebels back under the control of the British government. For others, it was a first step to freedom. And this is where history resists easy judgment. Patriots called it propaganda. Loyalists called it strategy. And some modern historians call it the first Emancipation Proclamation. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the uneasy space between calculation and miscalculation, promise and betrayal. And on the banks of the Elizabeth River, at a place called Great Bridge, that uneasy promise would help drive Virginia's royal governor into exile, setting loose a ripple that would carry far beyond the Revolution itself. Today, we're discussing Lord Dunmore's proclamation, and with us, we have Andrew Lawler.
My name is Andrew Lawler, and I'm a journalist and author of several books. My recent book is A Perfect Frenzy, A Royal Governor, His Black Allies, and the Crisis That Spurred the American Revolution. What drew me to this was during the pandemic, I went to visit my mother who lives in Norfolk, Virginia, where I grew up. And to get her out of the house, we went over to Williamsburg for a couple of days. And when I was there, I was in a bookstore and I ran across a mention of Lord Dunmore and this thing called the Ethiopian Regiment. I'd never heard of it before. I did a little digging and I ended up doing an online story for National Geographic for Black History Month. And then I became somewhat obsessed with the fact that I knew so little about what had happened in my home state during the revolution and that a lot of things had been not only left out, but obfuscated. So my journalistic instincts were whetted and I started to just go down as many rabbit holes as possible to discover who this person was and how they affected the beginning of the nation.
As we've been learning, the revolution in Virginia didn't erupt with a cannon blast. It began with a theft. In April 1775, days after the first shots at Lexington and Concord, Governor Dunmore ordered royal troops to seize the colony's gunpowder from the magazine in Williamsburg. To Virginians, a line had been crossed. The crown wasn't just governing anymore, it was disarming its citizens. Tension spiraled. But this wasn't the true beginning of the conflicts between the Patriots of Virginia and Governor Dunmore. In the spring of 1774, Parliament closed Boston Harbor. Virginia's burgesses gathered in Williamsburg, and they drafted a resolution calling for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer. It was a bold move. Only the king could declare such a day. And by doing so themselves, the House of Burgesses was staking a claim that ran far deeper than piety. Governor Dunmore knew what it meant. To let it stand would be a weakness. To dissolve the assembly was, in his eyes, the only lawful response. And so he dismissed them, scattering the burgesses into the Virginia night. But dissolutions have consequences. The men dismissed by Dunmore found another place to convene, the Raleigh Tavern. Outside the king's walls, they discovered they could govern themselves. That meeting became the seed of the Virginia Conventions. And by June 1775, nearly a year later, fearing for his family and for his life, Lord Dunmore abandoned the governor's palace altogether.
We think that Dunmore received a threat to his family and to other British officials who were in the palace. So he's living in the palace with his wife and 6 children. Very few people to defend himself. He only has a couple of dozen Marines, a couple of ships that are quite far away.
He became a governor without a governor's mansion, ruling from the decks of warships anchored off Norfolk. And so the line was drawn. Onshore, Virginians claimed new authority in their conventions and militias. Offshore, Dunmore clung to the kings. Both sides understood the stakes. Virginia was no longer simply a colony in dispute. It was a province in open rebellion and had a governor in exile plotting his next move.
So he has to come up with a plan to protect himself. And Dunmore comes up with a very particular plan, and that is he threatens to free enslaved people and give them weapons if he and his family and his officers are attacked. Now, this proves a very, very effective way to get the Patriots to back off, and they do. But of course, it sets in motion a series of events that will lead to bloodshed in Virginia.
So let's pause. How did we get here? Things hadn't always been this way. Dunmore had been a popular and celebrated member of Virginian society for most of his tenure. Maybe the answers come from his youth. In 1745, his father took part in the Jacobite uprising, and a teenage John Murray watched Bonnie Prince Charlie attempt to march to London with a makeshift army raised from disparate factions. Catholics, Presbyterians, Highlanders, anyone willing to fight. Dunmore absorbed that lesson. With the right mix of people, audacity, and leadership, it was possible to create an army from nothing. It was a lesson he would recall decades later in Virginia. That understanding, paired with the desperate situation in Virginia, helped to shape the moves he made during the summer and late fall of 1775.
It's not tea, it's not taxes, it's not these other things that are so important in New England. It's really the movement of these enslaved people and the threat that results of a massive slave insurrection.
In his mid-40s by the time of the American Revolution, Dunmore had spent formative years as a young man in Edinburgh, at the heart of the Scottish Enlightenment. He moved in salons where Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson debated morality, economics, and the ethics of human bondage. He brought this world with him to Virginia, a vast library, scientific tools, and musical instruments. He was a man steeped in philosophical ideals, but also a man who didn't hesitate to own enslaved people when he needed to participate in Virginia society, something he had in common with many of Virginia's planter class and leading revolutionaries.
Lord Dunmore became the royal governor of Virginia in 1771. So he was there for a full 4 years before the revolution really gets going. And he was actually quite a beloved governor among the Virginia elite. He becomes good friends with people like George Washington. He becomes Thomas Jefferson's first architectural patron. And he's very much one of the gang. He's bought plantations, he's bought enslaved people, And he is really the guy at the pinnacle of the Virginia gentry, these tobacco growers who are so wealthy. So in 1775, by the time the revolution begins, he's really endeared himself to the gentry by fighting a war in the Ohio Valley, where he actually secures what is now the state of Kentucky for Virginia. So he almost doubles the size of Virginia during his tenure. And he arrives back in Williamsburg to a glorious welcome at the end of 1774, and things seem to be going great for him until he finds out that, in fact, while he was gone in the wilds of the Ohio Valley, that things were beginning to go wrong in Virginia.
And yet, Dunmore did not come to Virginia willingly, complaining that the colony had little or no society. His wife, Lady Dunmore, was the architect of his career, maneuvering him first to the governorship of New York in 1770, and then to Virginia in 1771. Without her influence, he never would have set foot on these shores.
Now, Dunmore was a man who loved the city. He had lived in Edinburgh, he lived in London, he lived in New York. He loved city life. He loved socializing. He loved intellectual debate. And so when the king told him it was time for him to move to Virginia, he was horrified. He said, why would I want to go to a place where it's filled with fevers and there's no social life? He understood that Virginia was really a backwater. It was a place where people lived on remote plantations. There wasn't much of an intellectual life, and there was no real city except for the port of Norfolk. Williamsburg was basically a village with a couple thousand people, half of whom were enslaved. So Dunmore recognized that Virginia was not going to be a very exciting place, but of course, he proved really wrong on that point.
By November of 1775, Dunmore faced a perilous situation. The Virginia Committee of Safety was assembling thousands of men, marching from Williamsburg to Norfolk. And if you're looking for a refresher on the Virginia Committee of Safety, head to episode 2 of this season. He had no reinforcements from Boston, no fleets or troops from London. If he were to hold Virginia, he would have to raise an army from scratch, and fast. He tried recruiting Norfolk Scottish merchants and loyalist families, but most were men of commerce, not men of war. Their loyalty was tepid, their muskets largely ceremonial. Dunmore looked around at the enslaved people fleeing plantations to British lines. Here was a highly motivated force with much to gain. For them, a British victory held the potential of survival. Defeat meant return to plantations and almost certainly death for insurrection. So Dunmore made a choice, both practical and radical. Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation that would reverberate far beyond Virginia. He declared martial law and offered freedom to any enslaved person or indentured servant owned by a patriot who was willing to bear arms for the crown. Those who joined the British forces would be protected, armed, and promised liberty. Those who remained loyal to the colonists would continue under bondage. Conditional, yes. Calculated, yes. Granted, not as a moral act, but as a tool of war, a radical gamble to bolster his faltering army, yes. But freedom, nonetheless. The Patriots saw only provocation, the theft of property, the threat of armed insurrection. For enslaved Virginians, it was a promise of a different path to freedom.
Word of the Emancipation Proclamation gets out very, very quickly. It's printed in newspapers up and down the colonies, so it's well known. And remember, newspapers at that time were not simply something you read. They were something that was often read aloud within a crowd. So the news of this proclamation spread very, very quickly to both white and black communities. And we know that places like Maryland tried to prevent the news of the proclamation from reaching the ears of black people. They were not successful because within a matter of days and weeks, you have hundreds and maybe more enslaved people beginning to desert their plantations to reach the area around Norfolk, to reach British lines. So we know that people as far away as Massachusetts were fleeing, going south in order to find freedom. Because remember, the British in the North were not offering the same deal. Dunmore was the first British leader to propose granting freedom to those who would fight for the king. So as a result, you had people from as far away as Massachusetts, as far south as Georgia, who were flocking to this area. it's clear that these were really tough decisions within the Black community. They had to be made very quickly. Imagine you're living in a barn in some remote plantation in Virginia, and you get word that the royal governor is going to grant freedom to whoever shows up and will fight for the king. Now, you've got to weigh your options very carefully. Can you trust this information? Is it true? The Patriots, meanwhile, are putting out all kinds of propaganda that Dunmore can't be trusted, that he's a drunk, he's a lecher, he's not a trustworthy person. And even he might sell you to the West Indies, and you might face a far worse fate. You also had to worry whether or not if you left, your family and your friends left behind might be punished by the Patriots. This is something the Patriots were threatening to do. So these were incredibly hard decisions that people had to make with very little information. But nevertheless, hundreds of people are fleeing to the Norfolk area, and many of them are captured. We know the jails in Virginia are full by December of 1775. In Hampton, for example, I think there are like 20 or 30 people crammed into a space that's only large enough for a half dozen people. So this is a sign that many more people who tried to get there didn't actually reach Norfolk, that they actually were forced back or imprisoned.
On the Patriot side, one word captures their response: panic. And this panic wasn't contained to Virginia. It rippled through the Continental Congress in Philadelphia and all the way to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where George Washington, Dunmore's former friend, commanded the Continental Army. Washington wrote immediately, warning that Dunmore's proclamation could make the governor the greatest threat to America, far greater, he implied, than the British troops already at the doorstep. Why the fear? Because if Dunmore succeeded, he could create an army of tens of thousands, perhaps more, of Black men seeking freedom and willing to fight for the crown, men with intimate knowledge of the geography and social structure of the colonies. Such a force could crush the revolution before it truly began. The colonies recognized the danger as a national emergency. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress dispatched the first U.S. naval mission to Virginia to confront Dunmore and his multiracial forces, and in Virginia, the local press dispatched the power of the pen.
Well, the Patriots didn't have much in the way of bullets or artillery, but they did have the newspapers in Virginia. So as a result, immediately when the proclamation is published by these newspapers, it's published with all kinds of op-eds, we could say today, that talk about how ridiculous this proclamation is, how this shows that the British are indeed tyrants, that Dunmore can't be trusted. And this is when we get this very, very powerful propaganda campaign to denigrate Dunmore. This man who has actually been held in high esteem by the gentry until 1775 suddenly becomes almost a devil. In fact, they use a lot of images of Satan and the devil and hell to get across how evil this person is. So you see this sudden switch, and it's clear why. They really want to convince Black Americans not to trust him. So that's the first thing that they do, is launch this propaganda campaign where they also threaten enslaved people. They're told that their friends and family will be punished if they leave.
The goal was clear: convince enslaved Americans not to trust him and terrify white slaveholders that their property and their power was under threat. Despite this, Lord Dunmore was quickly able to assemble about 300 men.
Immediately, Lord Dunmore begins to create the Ethiopian Regiment. Now, many people ask me, so why Ethiopia? These are mostly West Africans, right? Well, the fact is that Ethiopia was a term of respect, maybe the only term of respect that Europeans used for Africans. Ethiopia, although it's in East Africa, was a Christian country. It was known as being a very civilized place. It was a place of sages, according to the ancients. So by calling it the Ethiopian Regiment, Dunmore was actually really signaling respect for the members of this regiment. And also, remember, the formal name of it was Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. He put his name on this, which I think shows, again, his real sense that these men were worthy of serving as soldiers and that they would fight well. So he creates a regiment. We don't have a lot of records to give us details, unfortunately, but we know it was made up of the enslaved people, mostly of Virginia and North Carolina. He also creates a regiment of mostly Scottish loyalists, who may not be the best fighters, since most of them are accountants and merchants, but nevertheless, they join in as well. And also a lot of local farmers and others who really feel at odds with the rest of Virginia and this kind of tobacco gentry culture, which in many ways is alien to Tidewater, Virginia. So it's a motley assembly of people, but Dunmore pulls them together and determines that the key place is Great Bridge. So let's talk about Great Bridge. So Great Bridge is an actual bridge that crosses the Elizabeth River south of Norfolk, about a dozen miles south of the port. And the reason it's so important is that if you're marching from Williamsburg, you've got to go across the James and then cut on your way east. And at some point, you've got to cross that bridge in order to circle around to reach Norfolk by land. So that is the key strategic crossing. If you can hold Great Bridge, then you can prevent anybody from reaching Norfolk.
The ensuing 2-week campaign, skirmishes through marsh and fog, was brutal and largely forgotten by history. Black soldiers and white patriots met in organized combat for the first time, inflicting and suffering casualties in equal measure. Dunmore's final assault failed. The Loyalists were driven back, Norfolk fell, and by winter his forces retreated to ships in the Chesapeake. Disease soon dealt the final blow. Smallpox swept through the fleet, forcing Dunmore to Gwen's Island. And by July 1776, after a failed counterattack, he and the remnants of his army, black and white, sailed for New York, where the Ethiopian Regiment would continue fighting for the crown. From Great Bridge, one story endured, that some soldiers wore shirts reading "Liberty to Slaves." Whether legend or fact, the symbolism is undeniable. Patriots touted liberty or death, proclaiming their fight for freedom, while on the other side stood men claiming liberty for themselves, once enslaved, now armed and resolute. That image, black men in red coats facing white revolutionaries, embodied the revolution's deepest paradox. Both sides fought for freedom, but defined it differently. For patriots, liberty meant independence and property. For the Ethiopian Regiment, it meant survival, autonomy, and the right to one's own body. True or not, those shirts captured the revolution's moral fault line, a war not just for power, but for the meaning of freedom itself.
As we've talked about, the Patriots were not offering freedom for the most part to enslaved people, whereas the British often were. So by the end of the war, you have thousands and thousands of people who'd been freed by the British, who were in ports like Charleston, Savannah, and New York. And in New York, that's the last place where the British are occupying, the last bit of American land that they're occupying after the Battle of Yorktown of 1781 and after the other ports have been evacuated. So at that point, there may be 3,000 or more Black Americans who were former slaves who've been freed often for many years, and they are facing this terrible circumstance. If the British leave them behind when they evacuate, as the British intend to do in 1783, then they face re-enslavement. And it's worth mentioning that George Washington himself sent slave catchers into Manhattan while the British still occupy the city in order to get back those enslaved people who had left Mount Vernon. So lots of patriots were eager to get these slaves back. And in fact, in the Treaty of Paris, there's a clause saying the British have to return all Negroes that they've taken to the Patriots. But because of a commander named Carleton, who decides that it wouldn't be fair to turn these people back to the Patriots, more than 3,000 Black men, women, and children are evacuated to Nova Scotia, to Canada, where they would be out of the range of the Patriots. Now, there were others who went on to live in London. There were some actually who went to Germany and lived in Germany, as well as the couple who went up in Australia. This is an incredible diaspora of Black Americans, the first real Black diaspora out of the United States, maybe some 10,000 people. And, it's really kind of a shocking truth that some 10,000 people had to flee a land dedicated to the notion of liberty.
The ripple effects of Dunmore's gamble stretched far beyond Virginia and the British Army. In June 1779, Sir Henry Clinton's Philipsburg Proclamation extended the promise of freedom across all rebellious colonies. Any enslaved person belonging to a patriot who reached British lines would be free. Unlike Dunmore's local edict, Clinton's was sweeping, both a military strategy and a moral statement that recognized enslaved people as agents in their own liberation. Word spread quickly through the South, prompting thousands to risk everything to escape. Many crossed rivers, forests, and battlefields to reach British positions, where officers provided food, shelter, and often military training. Enslaved people were no longer bystanders. They became an active force reshaping the war's southern front.
This was not just a call for male soldiers. This was really a call for Black Americans to support the king. There were so many things that women could do at that time, whether it was just simply the cooking and washing or the sewing or gathering food and food preparation. There was so much that women could contribute to the cause. It wasn't just a matter of a man carrying a musket. There were so many other jobs that both Black men and women and probably children were doing to support the Loyalists.
Recruitment under the Proclamation blended persuasion and logistics. British officers and Loyalist allies distributed leaflets, sent word through plantations, and created refugee enclaves near garrisons where fugitives were registered and trained. These became gathering points where escaped enslaved men and women were registered, organized, and sometimes trained. Officers would conduct basic military drills, teaching men to handle muskets, operate artillery, and follow commands. Those who showed aptitude were often assigned to specialized units, much like Dunmore had done with his Ethiopian regiment in Virginia. The scale dwarfed Dunmore's earlier effort. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of Black Loyalists joined the British cause, transforming both its manpower and its moral dimension. Patriots countered with threats and propaganda, but the promise of liberty and the peril of remaining enslaved proved stronger. The Philipsburg Proclamation turned the Southern theater into a contest not just of armies, but of ideologies, as the enslaved seized the Revolution's language of freedom for themselves. Dunmore's 1775 proclamation also forced a reckoning within the Continental Army. When Washington first took command in Cambridge, he barred Black men from service and refused to allow those already enlisted to re-enlist. But now, faced with the possibility that enslaved Americans might desert en masse to the British, Washington reversed course. By January 1776, he and the Continental Congress authorized a limited number of free Black men to serve, with restrictions loosening even further in 1777. Dunmore's proclamation didn't just threaten plantations, it forced patriots to confront the reality of freedom, loyalty, and manpower in the middle of a revolution.
Maybe most importantly, George Washington changes his mind about whether Black people should be in the Continental Army. When Washington arrived in the summer of 1775 in Cambridge as the new commander-in-chief, one of the first things he does is say, I don't want any Black men in the Army. And he doesn't want the Black men who are then in the Patriot Army to be able to re-enlist at the end of 1775. Now, suddenly, when he gets news of Lord Dunmore's proclamation toward the end of 1775, he changes his tune.
But spoiler alert here, I know we haven't gotten here in the podcast yet, but the British don't win the American Revolution. So what happens to the Black Loyalists at the end of the war?
Keep in mind that while there were many Black patriots, there were probably 3 times as many Black Americans who fought for the British, fought for the king. For obvious reasons, as we've talked about, the patriots were not offering freedom for the most part to enslaved people, whereas the British often were. So by the end of the war, you have thousands and thousands of people who had been freed by the British, who are in ports like Charleston, Savannah, and New York. And in New York, that's the last place where the British are occupying, the last bit of American land that they're occupying after the Battle of Yorktown of 1781 and after the other ports have been evacuated. So at that point, there may be 3,000 or more Black Americans who are former slaves who've been freed, often for many years, and they are facing this terrible circumstance. If the British leave them behind when they evacuate, as the British intend to do, in 1783, then they face re-enslavement. And it's worth mentioning that George Washington himself sent slave catchers into Manhattan while the British still occupy the city in order to get back those enslaved people who had left Mount Vernon. So lots of patriots were eager to get these slaves back.
General Sir Guy Carleton promised only to keep a record so that perhaps someday a financial settlement could be arranged. This record was called the Book of Negroes. It was filled with information of nearly 3,000 Black loyalists who fled the plantations of the American South to seek refuge with the British during the Revolutionary War. Compiled in 1783 under the supervision of British officials in New York, the book was a bureaucratic effort. Each entry recorded the person's name, age, physical description, former owner, and status. The book represents a critical moment of recognition. These were not anonymous human chattel. These were people whose freedom, their very lives, had been acknowledged and recorded. In practice, most of these claims were never paid. The Patriots made repeated attempts for 2 decades to recover their losses. And while some restitution was eventually granted, for the most part, they had to accept what they could not undo. For the formerly enslaved, this was a liberation that no treaty, no law, and no amount of post-war negotiation could reverse. Dunmore's proclamation had set in motion a diaspora, a disruption of the established order, and a tangible, lasting claim to freedom. One story that serves as an example of this is Harry Washington.
As you can imagine, he was owned by George Washington. He had been bought by Washington in Norfolk, actually, and he worked in the Dismal Swamp, one of the most terrible jobs you could have in Virginia, and then worked as a stable hand at Mount Vernon. As soon as Washington took off to fight the British in Massachusetts, Harry Washington left to join Lord Dunmore's forces. And then, after leaving Virginia, he ends up in New York with Lord Dunmore, where he then becomes part of the British Army. He fights in an artillery company in Charleston, South Carolina, and then goes back to New York, where he manages to be part of this evacuation in 1783. He gets away to Nova Scotia. So he moves to Nova Scotia, where these Black refugees are promised land and supplies, provisions, and those never really show up. Life there is really, really tough. They're treated badly by the local whites. And so many of them, including Harry, decide that it's time to look for a new home. That's when the possibility of settling this new place called Sierra Leone on the African coast comes about. It's an idea that's put forward by abolitionists in Britain. They send representatives to Nova Scotia who then convince hundreds and hundreds of people to sign up to go. So Harry Washington is one of these people who joins this flotilla that goes to the coast of Africa. And remember, Harry was born in Africa, right? He's born in Africa. So he returns to Africa, but this time he returns as kind of a leader of this group of people who arrive in Sierra Leone. They create a colony, but pretty soon, over a few years, Harry realizes that things haven't changed. The white people, even though they're abolitionists, are still running the show. They still won't grant the Black colonists full governance. They won't allow them to act on their own. So Harry is part of a group that actually foments a rebellion against the abolitionist leaders in Sierra Leone. Now, this is pretty quickly put down. Harry is tried for treason, and then he is exiled. He's sent across the river, and that's the last we hear of this really interesting person. So here you have somebody who was born in Africa, lived this incredible life in Mount Vernon, fighting for the British, South Carolina, New York, Canada, and then ending up back on the African continent. I don't think that any patriot could claim such an astonishing history.
And what of Lord Dunmore? He left Virginia in disgrace. Driven out after Great Bridge, his hold on the colony broken, Norfolk smoldering behind him. His proclamation was less a principled stand against slavery than a frenzied gambit to hold on to power. He offered freedom only to those who would fight for the crown, leaving the vast majority of Virginia's enslaved people in bondage. But the impact of the ideas in his proclamation, the potential to be free, would not be forgotten. And yet, the irony is this. What Dunmore meant as a tactic became something far more radical in its consequences. Enslaved men and women heard the words differently than he intended. They envisioned a possibility that patriots and loyalists in the South were unwilling to fully embrace, that liberty could belong to them too.
So while he's not an abolitionist, while I don't think he found slavery morally repugnant, he was somebody who actually did take the step of doing what the Patriots didn't, and that is freeing people who were trapped in lifetime servitude. The other thing that I think gets passed over is that the real heroes in this story are the enslaved people. These people who left their homes based on very little information in order to seek freedom, I think, underscore the terrors of slavery and the fact that people were willing to take enormous risks to find a better life, even if it was a very, very big gamble.
To the Patriots, Dunmore became synonymous with fear and betrayal. To the British, he was ultimately expendable, replaced as the war moved elsewhere. But to the thousands who risked everything in the wake of his words, he was the unlikely spark that lit the first wide-scale path toward freedom in the Revolutionary era.
I think the most important aspect of Dunmore's proclamation is that it really started a chain of events that ends with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. It's really important to understand that Dunmore's document provided Lincoln with the legal cover that he needed, the legal precedent he needed to make that proclamation public. So I think we really underestimated the impact of that proclamation in 1775. Even if the British lost, even if Dunmore was forced to leave Virginia, it nevertheless had these profound ripple effects that I think we still feel today.
Dunmore's story is not one of tragedy or triumph. It is one of contradiction. A man trying to save an empire who instead exposed its fault lines. His proclamation failed to deliver him victory, but it changed the moral landscape of the revolution and the future of freedom in America. We'd, of course, like to thank Andrew Lawler for his participation and expertise. We'd also like to thank you, our listeners, and encourage you to check out further resources like the primary sources and featured collection items mentioned in this episode at virginiahistory.org/Revolution Revisited.
Thanks for listening to Revolution Revisited. The American Revolution was not an ending, but a beginning. The stories continue to unfold. Subscribe now and catch the next episode for another journey through history. This podcast is made possible by William and Karen Fralin and presented by the Virginia Museum of History and Culture.
Revolution Revisited is a production of the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. Our production staff includes Haley Finner, Maggie Creech, Riley Reynolds, Nicole Martirana, and Tracy Schneider. Be sure to subscribe to get notified about upcoming episodes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Explore 16,000 years of Virginia history. The Virginia Museum of History and Culture offers a variety of exhibitions, public programs, and special events for the whole family. Learn more and plan your visit at virginiahistory.org.